Hey everyone. Welcome to 10C Stories. If you like the contents, please share and subscribe. We needed the money more than you needed a car, my father said dismissively. I hung up and called a lawyer instead. That night, my mom called at 2 a.m., sobbing. I never thought I'd be the reason my parents lost their home, but then again, I never thought they'd steal and sell my car to fund their third vacation of the year either. Funny how life works out sometimes. I'm 28 now, financially stable, and finally free of the guilt they piled on me my entire life. It took me too long to realize that, to them, I wasn't a son, I was just their permanent backup plan. Money troubles followed my parents like a shadow, though you'd never know it from looking at them. Mom wore designer clothes, Dad drove luxury cars, and our house was filled with expensive furniture they couldn't afford. Credit card statements arrived in red envelopes that Dad would hide in his office drawer. I found them once when I was 12, the numbers so large they didn't seem real. When I started working summer jobs at 16, saving every dollar became my religion. I'd watch my bank account grow while my parents laughed at my frugality. Why live like you're poor when you can enjoy life? Mom would say, showing off her new Coach purse. Meanwhile, I'd be calculating how many weeks of lawn mowing it would take to replace the emergency $200 they'd borrowed from my savings account. That was the first hit, small enough that I could rationalize it away, big enough that I should have seen what was coming. The college fund disappeared next. After years of being told they were saving for my education, I discovered the account had been drained months earlier. The money had funded their anniversary trip to Hawaii. When confronted, Dad shrugged it off. College is overrated, he said. Besides, student loans are normal. Everyone takes them. I worked 2 jobs through college while carrying a full course load, slept 4 hours a night, and ate ramen more often than not. Meanwhile, their Facebook page filled with photos from weekend getaways and expensive restaurants. My junior year, a collection agency called about a credit card I'd never opened. The card had maxed out at $15,000. The signature on the application looked like mine, but the handwriting was unmistakably Mom's. When I called her in a panic, she cried and said they'd been desperate. Dad got on the phone and reminded me that they'd given me life and sacrificed everything for me. I was too young, too programmed to obey, to fight back properly. I set up a payment plan that ate most of my income for the next 3 years. After graduation, I found a decent job and moved to an apartment 40 minutes away, not far enough, as it turned out, but the distance helped me start setting boundaries. I said no to small loans and ignored the guilt trips that followed. I started therapy to understand why saying no to my parents felt like committing a crime. For 3 years, I saved. I took overtime whenever possible, did freelance work on weekends, and tracked every dollar. My goal, a reliable car that was truly mine, no loans, no debt, just clean ownership. The day I bought that Honda Civic was the proudest of my life. It wasn't flashy, 4 years old with 42,000 miles, but it was paid in full, with the title in my name. To me, it represented everything I'd worked for: independence, responsibility, and freedom from financial anxiety. Mom rolled her eyes when she saw it. This is what you saved all that money for? You could have got something nicer if you just listened to us about investing. Their investment advice had always involved giving them money that somehow never materialized returns. I'd stopped falling for it, and the disappointment in their eyes when they couldn't access my savings was almost worth the years of struggle. Almost. I was away on a business trip when it happened, 3 days in Chicago, networking with clients and feeling like a real professional for the first time. I'd left my car in my assigned apartment parking spot, keys hanging on the hook inside my door. When I returned, exhausted from delayed flights and ready to crash, the parking spot was empty. My stomach dropped as I circled the lot twice, thinking I'd forgotten where I'd parked. Then panic set in. Had it been stolen? Towed? I called the property manager, then the towing companies, then finally the police. The officer who responded seemed unimpressed. No broken glass, no reports of suspicious activity, no evidence of theft. He took my statement with obvious skepticism. "You sure no family members might have borrowed it?" he asked. The question hit me like a bucket of ice water. I ran up to my apartment and checked the key hook empty. With shaking hands, I called my parents. The conversation that followed is seared into my memory, every word a fresh cut. "Hey, do you guys know anything about my car? It's not in the parking lot." Mom's voice turned sugary sweet, the tone she always used when she knew she'd crossed a line. "Oh, honey, we were going to talk to you about that." My blood went cold as Dad got on the phone, his voice carrying that familiar dismissive edge. "We needed the money more than you needed a car. You can just take the bus like you did in college." Mom jumped back in, talking fast. "It's for our anniversary trip to Cancun. 25 years deserves something special, and you're always so good at saving. You'll have another car in no time." I could barely form words. "You sold my car? How?" "The title was in my name." Dad cleared his throat. "Your mother works at the DMV, remember? She knows people. Her friend Eddie looked the other way on some paperwork, and that dealer on Highway 18 doesn't exactly run the tightest ship. Cash talks." My mouth went dry. Mom had worked at the DMV for 15 years, had access to my personal information, signature cards, everything needed to create convincing forgeries. I remembered Eddie from their dinner parties, the guy with the gold watch who always bragged about knowing how things really work. "You used Mom's government position to commit fraud. That's a felony. She could lose her job." The silence told me everything. Mom started crying. Dad started yelling about ungrateful children, and I hung up. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. Something inside me just broke, or maybe it finally fixed itself. For the first time in my life, I realized I could stop the cycle, and I was going to. I spent the night researching vehicle theft laws and calling in sick to work the next day. By noon, I was sitting across from Olivia, a lawyer friend who'd handled my roommate's landlord dispute the year before. Her eyes widened as I told her everything, not just about the car, but the years of financial abuse, the credit card fraud, the stolen savings, the endless guilt trips and manipulation. "Jack," she said, using my name like a lifeline to pull me back from the edge of my anger, "what they did isn't just wrong, it's criminal. And you have options." Those 3 words, "you have options," hit me like a revelation. I'd spent my entire life believing I had no choice but to endure whatever my parents did. Together, we gathered documentation. The car title transfer had my forged signature, easy to prove with past documents. The bill of sale showed they'd sold my 16,000 car for 16,000 car for 14,500, lowballing themselves in their hurry to get cash. I filed a police report for vehicle theft and forgery, started civil proceedings to recover the full value plus damages. Each step felt like removing a weight I'd been carrying since childhood. My parents' reaction was predictable. First came disbelief: "You wouldn't sue your own parents." Then emotional manipulation: "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us." Then minimization: "It was just a car, not like we took something important." The worst part? A tiny voice inside still made me question whether I was overreacting. That voice sounded suspiciously like my mother's. I silenced it by reading my journal entries from college, reminding myself of nights I'd gone hungry while they dined at steakhouses, of the crushing anxiety of working through pneumonia because I couldn't afford both medicine and the credit card payment for the debt they'd put in my name. This wasn't about a car. It had never been about a car. Word spread through the family like wildfire. Aunts and uncles I barely spoke to suddenly had my number, calling to remind me of family loyalty and how parents sacrifice everything. My cousin Marissa, always Mom's favorite niece, posted vague Facebook statuses about ungrateful children that everyone knew were about me. Only Aunt Sarah, Dad's sister, reached out with a different message. "It's about time," she texted. "They did the same thing to your grandfather. Some people never change unless they're forced to." That single message was a life raft in the storm. It hadn't just been me. Their behavior wasn't normal, and I wasn't wrong to finally stand up for myself. My parents tried everything to make me drop the case. They showed up at my workplace unannounced. I had security escort them out. They waited outside my apartment. I filed for a temporary restraining order. They sent a pathetic settlement offer of $200 monthly payments when we can afford it. My lawyer responded with a formal rejection. The worst was the night Mom called at 2 a.m., sobbing that they'd have to sell the house if I went through with this, that they'd be homeless, and it would be all my fault. I almost broke. Then I remembered finding my apartment door unlocked last week, things slightly moved inside, the feeling of violation knowing they'd used the emergency key I didn't realize they still had. "You should have thought about consequences before stealing from me," I said, and hung up. Court day arrived 6 months after the theft. I'd taken the morning off work, dressed in my best suit, and arrived early. My parents showed up late, looking like they'd aged years in months. I expected to feel something seeing them there: satisfaction, anger, even pity. Instead, I felt nothing like looking at strangers who happened to share my DNA. Their lawyer had dropped them after discovering the extent of the forgery, leaving them to represent themselves. Dad tried to play the concerned father, telling the judge how they'd always supported me and were just trying to teach responsibility. Mom cried on cue, talking about how much they loved me and how hurt they were by my vindictiveness. The tears dried up quickly when the evidence was presented: the forged documents, the fraudulent credit card from college. I'd also documented the pattern of financial abuse, laid bare in black and white. The judge wasn't impressed. "Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds," he said, his voice cutting through their excuses, "what you've done constitutes theft and fraud. The fact that the victim is your son makes this worse, not better. You violated a position of trust most people hold sacred." The judgment came down hard: full replacement value of the vehicle, $16,000, legal fees, $16,000, legal fees, $4,800, and additional damages for the forgery, $5,000. When they protested they couldn't pay, the judge ordered wage garnishment. I walked out of that courtroom feeling lighter than I had in years. The consequences for my parents came swiftly after the judgment. The garnishment took 25% of their income, which turned out to be far less than they'd always implied. The facade of wealth they'd maintained through credit and manipulation began to crumble. 3 months after the judgment, they missed their first mortgage payment, then the second. Foreclosure notices followed. I heard about it through Aunt Sarah, not them. They'd stopped speaking to me directly, instead telling anyone who would listen that I was a heartless son who'd ruined them over a simple misunderstanding. But the family narrative was shifting. When Dad's cousin saw the court documents during a visit, he started asking questions about money he'd loaned them years ago. Mom's sister discovered her identity had been used for a store credit card. The pattern was bigger than me, and finally, others were seeing it. Meanwhile, I bought a new car, a slightly newer Honda, nothing flashy but fully mine. I started therapy to deal with the lingering guilt and anxiety, opened a separate savings account specifically for a house down payment, and lived simply but comfortably, enjoying the freedom of financial independence without the constant drain of supporting my parents' lifestyle. 6 months after the judgment, they reached out through Aunt Sarah. They wanted to reconcile, she said, talk about moving forward as a family. I agreed to meet in a public place, a coffee shop downtown. They looked different, wearing clothes I didn't recognize, driving a car that was at least beyond their means. The foreclosure had gone through, and they'd moved to a small apartment in a rundown complex across town. Mom tried to hug me. I stepped back. Dad launched into a speech about forgiveness and family bonds. I listened silently, waiting for what I knew would never come, a genuine apology and acknowledgement of the harm they'd done. Instead, Mom slid a piece of paper across the table, a payment plan for me to help them with their rent until they could get back on their feet. I stood up without a word and walked out. That night, I blocked their numbers and every social media connection, changed my emergency contacts at work, and officially cut the cord. It's been a year since the judgment, 3 weeks since I closed on my house, nothing fancy, a modest 3-bedroom in a good neighborhood with a small yard and a garage for my car. Every piece of furniture I own, I bought with money I earned. Every bill gets paid on time. My credit score is excellent. Through the family grapevine, I hear my parents are still struggling. Dad took a job at a big box store. Mom lost her DMV position after the fraud investigation. They complained constantly about how unfair life is, how their ungrateful son abandoned them when they needed him most. They don't mention the stolen car, the forged documents, or the 27 years they spent treating me like their personal ATM. Before hitting rock bottom, they tried one last desperate play. Thanksgiving at Aunt Sarah's house became their hunting ground. I skipped it but heard the whole sordid tale afterward. They showed up with a folder full of medical documents, all fake, according to my cousin who works at the hospital. Dad claimed he needed an expensive surgery insurance wouldn't cover. Mom sobbed about possibly losing him if they couldn't raise $18,000. Uncle Rob, always the soft touch, was reaching for his checkbook when Aunt Sarah interrupted. "Wait," she said, "let me see those papers." The hospital letterhead was outdated, the doctor's name misspelled. When confronted, Mom stormed out, Dad following behind, shouting that the family had turned against them just like their ungrateful son. That was their last invitation to a family gathering. The final bridge burned. The last safety net snapped. Last week, Aunt Sarah came to my housewarming party. She brought a small plant and a card that said, "Roots of your own finally." She told me my parents had been asking family members for loans again. No one was giving them money anymore. "They'll never change," she said quietly as we stood in my new kitchen. "But you did. And that's what saved you." I feel nothing when I think of them now, not anger, not guilt, just nothing. They're strangers who share my genetic code, people I used to know. Sometimes I pass the bus stop where my mother now waits for her ride to work. I don't stop, don't roll down the window, don't offer her a ride in the car I bought to replace the one they stole. I just drive past, toward the home I built for myself, the life I protected by finally saying no. People ask if I regretted cutting off my parents, pursuing legal action, refusing to help them now. The answer is always the same: my only regret is not doing it sooner. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to stop protecting them from the consequences of their own actions. Sometimes the most essential act of self-care is recognizing that family is a privilege, not a right, and that privilege can be lost. I sleep soundly in my new house, no anxiety about midnight phone calls demanding money, no guilt about saying no, no fear that what I've built will be taken from me. I'd be lying if I said I never questioned myself. Last winter, during a snowstorm, I drove past that run-down apartment complex and saw my mother waiting at the bus stop, shivering without a proper coat. My hand hovered over the window control for a split second. Something primal and deeply programmed almost made me stop. I kept driving. That night, I sat in my warm living room and really asked myself, was I the monster they claimed I was? Had I become cruel in my pursuit of freedom? The questions haunted me enough that I called my therapist for an emergency session. She helped me see the truth: compassion without boundaries isn't compassion, it's self-destruction. They hadn't changed. The same people who sold my car would take my house if given half a chance. The same people who forged my signature would empty my accounts. The same people who called me heartless would use my heart against me until there was nothing left. Sometimes healing means walking away and not looking back. Sometimes love means refusing to enable destruction. Sometimes family is what you build, not what you're born into. For the first time in my life, I am free, and it's worth every difficult step, every painful realization, every second-guessed decision it took to get here.